I live in a small white house on the edge of Charleston, South Carolina. It is not the grandest house on the street, not even close. The paint peels in a few places along the shutters, and the porch creaks whenever you step on the uneven boards. But it is mine. The oak tree in the yard stretches its arms wide, leaning just slightly toward the house, as though it wants to listen to the secrets whispered inside. When I first moved in with my husband, Andrew, the house felt alive, as if it had been waiting for us to fill its rooms with laughter, and we did. For years, its walls echoed with Sunday morning music, with the sizzling of pancakes on the griddle, with the sound of Daniel's baby giggles and Andrew's voice reading bedtime stories. Then one stormy night, the phone rang, and with it came a kind of silence that never really left. The voice on the other end was shaky and formal, and the words seemed rehearsed. There had been an accident in New York, an unfortunate incident during Andrew's business trip. He had not survived. My body went cold, my knees buckling under me until I collapsed on the kitchen floor. I remember clutching Daniel, only 5 at the time, his small arms around my neck as if he could sense that my entire world had just shattered. They gave me a death certificate a week later, handed over with practiced sympathy. But nobody ever returned to me. No coffin. No chance to touch him one last time. Just paper, ink, and silence. For 3 years, I carried that silence with me. It seeped into every corner of the house. The laughter was gone, replaced by the sounds of my son's growing feet and the endless ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Nights were the worst. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for a voice that would never come. Grief does strange things. Sometimes I swore I heard Andrew's footsteps in the hallway or caught a faint whiff of his cologne. Other times, I wanted to scream at him for leaving me to raise Daniel alone. Life became about survival, not joy. I worked as a bookkeeper at a small firm downtown, making just enough to get by, $45,000 a year, stretched thin over bills, groceries, and school supplies. Every dollar was accounted for, every expense weighed against whether Daniel needed it more. Vacations, luxuries, even small indulgences felt impossible. I kept myself together because Daniel needed me too. But every night when the lights went out, grief pressed against my chest like a stone. Daniel grew, as children do, even in the shadow of loss. At 8 years old, he already had his father's eyes. Deep green, steady, impossible to ignore. He had a curious nature, asking questions about everything from why the sky turned pink at sunset to whether his dad could see us from heaven. Those questions cut me open, yet they also kept me moving. I refused to let him see me broken. I smiled when I wanted to cry, told stories when silence threatened to suffocate us, and made our little house feel like a place where safety still lived. Still, Daniel noticed things. He noticed the way I avoided looking at Andrew's photograph on the mantel. He noticed the way I sometimes touched the empty side of the bed as though someone were still there. And he noticed the weight in my shoulders that I tried so hard to hide. One morning, everything shifted. We were sitting at the breakfast table. I had just poured Daniel a bowl of cereal, the cheap kind with marshmallows that he loved, while I sipped bitter coffee, wishing it could fill the space inside me. Daniel looked at me with those piercing green eyes and asked, in a voice that was both innocent and wise, "Mom, can we go to the beach? Just you and me?" The words stopped me. They were simple, but they carried a weight I hadn't felt in years. The beach. A place I used to love, where Andrew and I had once walked hand in hand, where we had taken Daniel as a toddler to dip his toes in the surf. I hadn't gone back since Andrew's death. The idea of the ocean, vast and endless, had always seemed like a mirror of my grief, something too big to face. But when Daniel asked, something inside me shifted. I looked at him, really looked, and realized how much of his childhood was slipping away while I drowned in silence. He deserved more than my grief. He deserved joy, memories, sunlight. And maybe, just maybe, I did too. That afternoon, I rummaged through an old jewelry box and found the gold bracelet Andrew had given me on our 5th anniversary. I had kept it tucked away, unable to wear it without crying. But now I held it in my hand and made a decision. I walked into a small pawn shop downtown and sold it for $500. The man behind the counter didn't know that he was holding years of love, laughter, and pain in his hands. To him, it was just gold. To me, it was a sacrifice, an offering for something better. With that money, I booked 2 round-trip tickets to Miami. I clicked confirm on the screen, my hands trembling, as though I had just leaped off a cliff. Miami wasn't just a trip. It was a chance to breathe again, a chance to step outside the prison of my sorrow. I told Daniel that night, and his face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since before Andrew's death. "Really, Mom? Just us?" he asked, nearly bouncing with excitement. I nodded, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. The days leading up to the trip were filled with anticipation. I packed carefully, folding swimsuits and sunscreen into a suitcase that had collected dust in the closet. I dug out Daniel's sand pail and shovel, the ones he hadn't used since he was 5. At work, I told my boss I needed a week off, and though he raised an eyebrow, he agreed. It was the first real vacation I had taken since Andrew died. But beneath the excitement, fear simmered. I worried about money, about leaving the safety of routine, about what memories might rise when I saw the ocean again. At night, I sat on the porch under the leaning oak tree, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves. I whispered to Andrew, as I sometimes still did when the silence felt too heavy. "I don't know if I can do this," I confessed softly. "But Daniel needs it, and maybe I do too." The night before we left, I walked through the house, turning off lights one by one. I lingered in the hallway where Andrew's photograph still hung. His smile looked frozen in time, untouched by grief or secrets. I placed my hand against the frame, feeling the cool glass beneath my fingertips. For 3 years, this house had been my cage and my comfort, the place where silence lived with me. But tomorrow, for the first time, we would step beyond its walls. As I crawled into bed beside Daniel, who had already fallen asleep with a grin on his face, I realized something profound. Grief had stolen so much from us, but it had not stolen everything. I still had my son, my strength, and the possibility of a future not defined by loss. Tomorrow, the journey would begin, not just to Miami, but toward a new chapter in our lives. And in that quiet moment, as the clock ticked steadily down the hallway, the silence in the house felt just a little less heavy. The airport was alive, with its usual chaos, the kind that swallows you whole if you let it. People rushed past, dragging rolling suitcases, clutching coffee cups, checking their tickets with frantic eyes. Announcements echoed over the loudspeakers, a jumble of flight numbers and boarding gates. For most of the travelers, it was just another day, another flight. But for me and Daniel, it felt like a step into another world. Daniel clutched my hand, tightly as we moved through the crowd, his small palm warm against mine. He was practically buzzing with excitement, his eyes darting everywhere, at the long lines of passengers, the blinking departure boards, the glittering shops selling overpriced souvenirs. I could feel his energy pulsing through me, softening. The weight I had been carrying for so long. For once, his joy was stronger than my fear. Still, as we waited at the gate, a heaviness stirred in the back of my chest. Traveling without Andrew felt unnatural. He had always been the one to double-check the tickets, to keep track of the boarding passes tucked safely in his wallet. Now it was just me. I glanced down at Daniel, who was fiddling with a pack of crayons I had bought to keep him entertained during the flight. His green eyes, so much like his father's, caught mine, and he grinned. "This is gonna be fun, Mom." I nodded, swallowing back the ache in my throat. "Yes, sweetheart, it will be." When boarding was called, we shuffled into line with the other passengers. The smell of jet fuel drifted faintly through the air as we walked down the jet bridge, the metal walls echoing with footsteps. Stepping onto the plane felt surreal. I guided Daniel to our seats near the back, an aisle and a window, just for us. He immediately pressed his small forehead to the glass, watching as the luggage was loaded below. The hum of the engines began to stir as passengers filed in, stowing bags overhead and exchanging polite nods. I buckled Daniel in, then myself, and exhaled slowly. This was it. We were really leaving Charleston behind, even if just for a week. That was when Daniel tugged my sleeve. Mom, he whispered, his voice curious but insistent. That man looks like Dad. I froze. My heart jolted against my ribs, my breath catching as I followed his gaze. He was pointing toward row 12 across the aisle, where a man had just settled into his seat. Dark hair, broad shoulders, the same posture, the same tilt of the head that I had memorized 1,000 times. For a moment, my stomach dropped as though the plane had already leapt into the sky. It couldn't be. I forced a smile, my lips trembling as I reached to smooth Daniel's hair. Sweetheart, sometimes people just look alike, I whispered. My voice was calm, but my hands trembled in my lap. Still, I couldn't stop staring. I tried to distract myself by opening the novel I had brought, its pages full of words I couldn't absorb. Every few minutes, my eyes slid toward him. His profile was unmistakable, the way he rested his hand casually on the armrest, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw. My pulse quickened, a steady thrum that drowned out the steady hum of the engines. I told myself grief was playing tricks again, as it had so many nights before. My mind had conjured his face in the shadows of our hallway, in the crowds downtown, in the soft outlines of dreams. This was no different. It had to be no different. The plane took off, the engines roaring as the ground fell away. Daniel squealed with delight, pressing his hands to the window, his laughter spilling over the sound of rattling trays and seatbelts clicking tight. I smiled for his sake, though my eyes wandered again to row 12. The man shifted, leaning back. With a sigh, and for one terrifying moment, I thought he looked right at me. My breath hitched, but then he turned his head toward the window, oblivious. Relief and disappointment tangled inside me like warring tides. The hours stretched on, and Daniel eventually grew restless. I handed him crayons and a small notebook, watching as he scribbled colorful shapes and stick figures. Every so often, he looked up, as if expecting me to notice the man again, but I refused to give it more attention. Instead, I focused on Daniel's drawings, on the safety of his small world where the only thing that mattered was whether he had enough colors for his picture. By the time the captain announced our descent into Miami, I was exhausted. Not from the flight itself, but from the battle raging in my mind. Logic told me it wasn't Andrew. It couldn't be. But my heart whispered otherwise, and that whisper haunted me as we touched down on the bright Florida runway. The Miami air was heavy, thick with salt and heat. Palm trees swayed outside the airport windows as we collected our bags, Daniel practically bouncing with excitement. He chattered nonstop about the ocean, about building sandcastles taller than himself, about how many seashells he could collect before bedtime. I let his words fill the silence I couldn't bear. The cab ride to the Ocean Breeze Hotel was short, but every block seemed like a blur. Miami was alive in a way Charleston never was. Neon signs, music spilling from open windows, laughter echoing from crowded sidewalks. Daniel pressed his face to the glass, pointing at everything, while I clutched the handle of my bag tightly, my thoughts spiraling back to the man on the plane. The hotel was perched right across from the shoreline, its pale blue walls gleaming under the sun. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of jasmine and citrus, with polished floors that clicked beneath our shoes. At the desk, I checked us in, smiling tightly at the receptionist, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Our room was simple but inviting, with 2 beds draped in crisp white sheets, a small dresser, and a sliding glass door that opened onto a balcony. From there, I could see the ocean stretching endlessly, the waves rolling in with a rhythm that was both soothing and terrifying. Daniel ran immediately to the balcony, shouting with glee as the sea breeze whipped through his hair. That night, after we unpacked and ordered pizza from a place down the street, Daniel fell asleep quickly, his small body curled beneath the blanket, his hand clutching the stuffed bear he had carried since toddlerhood. I lingered beside him for a while, brushing his hair gently from his forehead, my heart aching with love and fear all at once. Needing air, I stepped out onto the balcony. The night was warm, the sky painted with stars, the sound of the waves steady below. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the scent of salt and jasmine wash over me. For a moment, I felt calm. Then I froze. From the balcony just below ours, I heard a voice. His voice. It was deep, familiar, and certain, carrying over the gentle crash of the waves. A voice I had sworn I would never hear again. My entire body trembled. My legs weak as I gripped the railing, clinging to it as though the world beneath me might collapse. It was impossible. And yet, as the laughter and words drifted upward, I knew the truth with bone-deep certainty. The man I had buried in my heart was alive. The morning sun poured through the thin curtains of our hotel room, filling it with a golden warmth that felt almost cruel. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to Daniel's steady breathing as he slept beside me. My heart, however, had not rested all night. The voice from the balcony still echoed in my ears, threading through my dreams like a ghost that refused to be silenced. I told myself over and over that it couldn't be real, that exhaustion and memory had betrayed me, but deep down, I knew the truth. I dressed quietly and slipped out, leaving Daniel tucked safely under the blankets. My body moved before my mind could catch up, as though instinct was pulling me toward the answer I dreaded. The elevator ride down felt endless, each floor clicking by with painful slowness. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into the lobby and froze. There he was. Andrew. He stood near the reception desk, tall and familiar, his presence undeniable. He wasn't a memory, not a dream. He was flesh and bone, breathing the same air as me. My stomach dropped, my knees went weak, yet a strange surge of fire burned in my chest. Beside him was a woman in a red dress, elegant and poised, her hand looped through his arm like she belonged there. For 3 years, I had grieved. For 3 years, I had scraped together pieces of myself, all while raising our son alone. And here he was, alive, smiling faintly as though he had never left. Something inside me snapped. Andrew. The word tore from my throat before I could stop it. Sharp, accusing, trembling. His head whipped around, his eyes meeting mine, and in an instant his face drained of color. Shock flashed across his features, followed by something deeper, fear. The woman in red glanced between us, confusion etched across her face. "Do you know her?" she asked, her voice soft but wary. Andrew swallowed hard, disentangling himself from her. Please, excuse me," he stammered before crossing the room toward me. His hands shook as he reached out, though I recoiled, before he could touch me. "You're supposed to be dead," I hissed, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. The room seemed to tilt, the floor unsteady beneath me. "I had no choice," he whispered, his voice frantic, desperate. "Please listen to me. No choice?" My voice rose, fierce and trembling. "You left me to raise our son alone. You left me to bury you without a body, to explain to Daniel why his father wasn't coming home. You think that was protection?" His eyes filled with tears, but I saw no comfort in them. "There were men, dangerous men," he said, lowering, his voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. "I owed them nearly $70,000. They threatened us, threatened you, threatened Daniel. Faking my death was the only way to keep you safe." I laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. "Safe? You destroyed us. Do you know what it was like to hold a crying child every night? To work until I collapsed just to keep food on the table, while you hid somewhere else in the world pretending you didn't exist?" My words shook with rage, but beneath it all, a deeper wound bled silently. Betrayal. "I thought I was protecting you," he whispered again, his hands trembling as he raked them through his hair. "If they thought I was gone, they'd leave. You alone. I never wanted this, but I couldn't see another way." My chest heaved, my breath unsteady. I stared at him, at the man I had loved, the man I had mourned, the man who stood now as a stranger before me. The years of silence, of aching loneliness, surged between us like a wall I couldn't climb. Behind me, the receptionist's phone rang, the ordinary sound jarringly out of place. The woman in the red dress had retreated to the far side of the lobby, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but I didn't care about her. All I could see was Andrew, alive, guilty, and begging with his eyes for something I wasn't sure I had left to give. You don't get to explain this away, I said, my voice breaking. You don't get to vanish, to leave me drowning, and then walk back into our lives as if nothing happened. He flinched, pain etched into his face. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, he admitted, his voice raw. But please let me see him. Let me see Daniel. He deserves to know his father is alive. For a long moment, I said nothing. Rage battled with heartbreak inside me. Every instinct screamed to turn and walk away, to shield Daniel from the man who had abandoned us. But then I thought of my son's hopeful face on the plane, the way he had pointed to the stranger who looked like his father. I thought of the ache in his voice when he asked if Andrew could see us from heaven. And suddenly, I knew I couldn't take this choice from him. Fine, I said finally, my words like steel. But this is for Daniel, not for you. Don't think for 1 second that you can erase what you did to us. Andrew nodded quickly, relief flooding his expression. He looked broken, older, and yet still so achingly familiar. Thank you, he whispered, though the gratitude in his voice only twisted the knife deeper. When Daniel saw him later that morning, it was as if the world tilted on its axis. We were in the courtyard by the pool, the sunlight shimmering across the water. Daniel spotted him first, his eyes going wide, his mouth falling open in disbelief. Dad? He breathed, his voice quivering. Andrew knelt instinctively, his arms open wide. And before I could stop him, Daniel ran. Ran with all. The speed of his small legs crashing into his father's arms with a cry that was half joy, half shock. The sound tore through me, splitting me apart. Daniel clung to him, laughing through his tears, his voice bright with relief. I stood at a distance, my arms folded tight across my chest, my body rigid. Watching them together was like standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling in my ears. Part of me wanted to crumble, to give in to the illusion of family restored. But another part of me screamed, reminding me of the nights I had held Daniel alone, of the years spent scraping by, of the silence that had become my closest companion. Andrew held Daniel tightly, his face pressed into our son's hair, his shoulders shaking. I'm here, buddy, he whispered. I'm here. And though the sight made Daniel glow with joy, it left me trembling, torn between the life we once had and the reality we now faced. Andrew might have returned, but the cost of his absence would never be undone. The days that followed unfolded. Slowly, like fragile pages in a book I wasn't sure I wanted to keep reading. The sun was bright, the waves constant, and the beach stretched endlessly before us. Daniel woke each morning with an energy I hadn't seen in years, bounding out of bed to throw on his swim trunks and drag me downstairs. But it wasn't me he was running toward anymore. It was his father. Andrew was always waiting in the courtyard, as if he had memorized Daniel's rhythm in the short time they had been reunited. Together, they walked across the street to the sand, Daniel's hand clasped tightly in his father's, their voices rising in excited chatter. I followed behind, slower, carrying the towels and sunscreen, my eyes never leaving them. On the shoreline, I watched them build castles with Daniel's old pail and shovel. They sculpted towers and walls, dug moats that filled with seawater, and raced to keep the waves from destroying their work. Daniel's laughter carried across the breeze, sharp and clear, like a bell ringing through the air. I sat on a striped beach chair, the ocean wind tugging at my hair, and my heart twisted with a storm of emotions. Love for my son's happiness, grief for the years stolen, and a raw, unshakable sense of betrayal. Every so often, Andrew glanced back at me. His eyes searched mine, as if hoping for a sign that I might soften, that I might welcome him back into the place he had abandoned. But I kept my expression unreadable. He might be Daniel's father, but he no longer had a claim to me. At night, after Daniel fell asleep, the real battles began. Andrew would wait for me on the balcony, his voice low, urgent, trying to mend what had been shattered. I never stopped loving you, he swore one evening, his hands gripping the railing as though the metal could anchor him to the truth he wanted me to believe. Not for a single day. I folded my arms across my chest, steadying myself. You may be his father, I said firmly, but you no longer define my life. Do you understand that? He flinched, his jaw tightening, but he nodded. I deserve that. But please, at least know that everything I did was for you, for Daniel. For us? The words cut from my throat, sharp and bitter. You call vanishing, leaving us to grieve, for us? Do you know how many nights I held our son as he cried for you? Do you know how many times I worked until my body broke just to keep a roof over our heads? Don't you dare call that protection. His face crumbled under the weight of my words, but I didn't let the silence save him. You left us, Andrew. You made a choice and we paid the price. He didn't argue after that. Instead, he lowered his head, and for the first time, I saw him not as the man I once loved, but as a man broken by his own choices, carrying a guilt he couldn't undo. Still, Daniel's joy softened the sharp edges. He woke each day hungry for time with his father. They tossed a football on the beach, splashed in the waves, collected seashells, and lined them up proudly along the balcony railing. Daniel's voice bubbled with questions. Where had his dad been? What had he been doing? Why had he left? Andrew dodged some answers, but I insisted on honesty when I was present. If he wanted to be part of Daniel's life again, he couldn't rebuild it with lies. One evening, I joined them on the sand. Daniel begged me to help decorate the castle they had made, insisting I find the prettiest shells to crown the towers. For a few brief moments, we worked side by side, the three of us, laughter spilling into the sea air. It was almost like the past had returned, almost like we were the family we once had been. But then the illusion cracked, as it always did, when I caught sight of the deep lines etched in Andrew's face, the shadow in his eyes that spoke of debts, secrets, and years lost. No matter how brightly Daniel smiled, I could not forget. Our last day arrived sooner than I was ready for. Daniel woke early, his face glowing with excitement. Can we go one more time, Mom? To the beach, just for a little? I nodded, though my chest tightened with the weight of departure. We spent the morning under the sun, Daniel and Andrew racing along the surf, their laughter mingling with the crash of the waves. I stayed back, watching, memorizing every detail of my son's joy, while reminding myself that my future was not tied to the man running beside him. Later, as we packed our suitcases, Daniel looked at me with eyes so hopeful that it broke me, all over again. Mom, he asked quietly, can Dad visit us in Charleston? Please? I hesitated, my hands pausing over the zipper of the suitcase. His voice trembled with longing, his small hands clutching the fabric of his shirt. I wanted to protect him, to shield him from the inevitable hurt. But I also knew I couldn't deny him the chance to know his father. I looked at him slowly and nodded. On my terms, I said firmly. If he wants to be in your life, it will be the way I decide, in the time I decide. Daniel's face lit up, his joy spilling into the room. Thank you, Mom. He threw his arms around me, his embrace fierce and full of trust. Andrew stood quietly near the balcony, his voice almost reverent when he said, I'll do whatever you ask, whatever it takes. The flight home felt quieter than the one that had brought us to Miami. Daniel leaned against me, his small hand gripping mine as he drifted into sleep. I stared out at the clouds, the endless blue stretching far beyond, and realized something profound. I was no longer the same woman who had once collapsed on the kitchen floor, clutching a death certificate. I was no longer the woman who measured every day in loss, who let grief define her. I had survived. I had carried my son through the storm, and in the process, I had discovered a strength I never knew I had. Andrew might return to Charleston, and perhaps he would keep his promise this time. Perhaps he would truly try to be the father Daniel deserved. But whether he stayed or left again, my life no longer revolved around him. My happiness, my peace, would never again rest in the hands of a man who had abandoned me. As the plane cut through the sky, I pressed a kiss to Daniel's hair and whispered, "We're going to be okay." Because in the end, I understood what I had not known 3 years ago. My life was not defined by who left or who returned, but by the choices I made each day, the love I poured into my son, and the strength I had built from the ashes of loss. I didn't forgive Andrew. Not fully, maybe not ever. But I accepted that he existed, and I allowed Daniel the chance to know his father. That was enough. For me, the true beginning was not Andrew's return. It was the moment I claimed my own freedom, the moment I understood that happiness could be mine again, not because of him, but despite him. And as the clouds parted to reveal the land below, I held my son tighter, knowing that every sunrise ahead belonged to us,